And we, of course, are now speaking with him in a changed world. Professor Richard Wolff is professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He is also a visiting professor in the graduate program of international affairs at the New School University in New York. And he is the host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV, which airs Tuesdays from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern. And you can find much of his work at democracyatwork.info. And first of all, Richard Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Richard. And even under these strange circumstances, it's good to be able to continue at least some of our life activities.
Absolutely. And, you know, before we get into the economics of all this, among other things, this pandemic is a reminder to me of the importance of connectedness, of solidarity, of community, and conversations such as these reinforce all of those things for me.
Right. And if I could add, I don't mean to, excuse me, preempt our conversation, but if those values of solidarity, of a shared commitment to the health of a public that recognizes that an illness in one of us can and is obviously now spreading to all of us, and so we are all linked together in ways we really didn't know, that kind of an understanding would never have allowed the absence of planning for such a pandemic, the absence of producing the ventilators, the hospital beds, the test kits, the financial resources to cope. If public health had been the solidarity we want it to be, instead of private profit, we would have produced what we can produce, which would have been enough. We would have stockpiled it, which would have made it available now, and we would have it at our disposal to reduce this disaster. All of those things were sacrificed on the altar of private profit. The companies don't make money by producing these things. They don't make money by stockpiling them. The government is trying to save money out of the same mentality. So all of them failed to do what we knew would be necessary the next time this kind of thing has happened. Viruses are part of our lives. Viruses have been with us since the beginning of human life and much before. In 1918, we had a thing which is misnamed the Spanish flu, which killed over a quarter of the people living on this planet back in 1918, a virus which in that case started in the state of Kansas. I mean, you put all of what we knew together and the failure of this system and of our leadership to prepare for, to be able to cope with, it is, for me, the most overwhelming tragedy of it all, beyond even the tragedy of the illness and its spread.
You know, I couldn't agree more. And, you know, if anything good is to come out of the suffering that has happened and what is very likely the greater suffering to come, I would hope it would be some understanding of what you just said, some understanding of the fact that, Richard Wolff, I think we have been living in almost a collective version of drunk driving, where, you know, a drunk driver may get home from the bar 3 or 4 nights, maybe more, and he, you know, in his irrational mode of thinking, he says, well, you know, I've been making it home. There's no problem, but it's only a matter of time until the crash comes and you hurt yourself, or worse yet, for your psyche, you hurt someone else. And I feel as if, you know, sometimes drunk drivers learn from their accidents, sometimes they don't. And my concern at this moment in history is that since we're clearly going to be paying a large human price, already are, for our collective negligence and delusion, I'm just hoping we can all do the most we can to ensure that we learn something from this.
Yeah, I saw a statistic, just to drive the point home yet one more way. I saw a statistic earlier today that indicated that in China, South Korea, France, Germany, and Japan, they have somewhere between 5 and 8 hospital beds per 1,000 of their people, and that the United States has 2.8. Now, I ask you, since we are arguably a much richer country than any of those I just listed, and since we claim to be a democracy that responds first and foremost to what the majority of people need, and public health is not only a majority need, it's literally a universal 100% need, then you have to explain how it is that the preparation for a disaster, which is just as reasonable a precaution in every one of those countries I listed, is responded to in every one of them 3 to 4 times the way it's responded to in the United States. And the answer is we have a private, profit-dominated system. The bottom line, as the corporations like to tell us, is making money. And when that's your bottom line in the workplaces that produce the goods and services everyone needs, it very quickly becomes the bottom line mentality that governs everything else. So even if the hospital is quote unquote a non-profit entity, it thinks the same way. Its executives were trained and educated the same way. So it's busy avoiding the loss of profit in the accounts it keeps by having spare beds, the kind of things that will save a life. I'm an economist, and I can already assure everyone listening or watching, we have already lost more money, and this pandemic is in its early phases in this country. We have already lost more money than it would have taken to provide the stockpiles of ventilators, test kits, hospital beds, and everything else needed for this. That wasn't a mistake that some short-sighted persons made. That is a systemic problem because we put profits first and then tell ourselves make-believe stories ennobled by professional economists, I'm ashamed to say, that doing what's best for profit will in some magical way be what's best for a profit-driven society. We're living through the concrete proof that that's wrong.
Well, and I guess the question, let's start there, Professor Richard Wolff, with the economics profession. Now, as someone who writes about economics, I'm not an economist, I watched with something like horrified fascination after the 2008 financial crisis when people, Alan Greenspan, whoever you want to name, most people, even in the heart of the economic establishment, had to admit, even publicly, we got it wrong. Our ideologically based conception of a free market, which we claim is a neutral scientific interpretation, clearly failed. And it took massive government intervention to correct it. So we need to reassess. But then it seemed as if the entire world around them, their colleagues, politicians, academia, everybody, no, it's all right. We can go back to the way we were. And it felt like within a year or two, the entire lesson of 2008 had vanished down the memory hole. And now, I'm wondering, first of all, I guess it's a two-part question for you. Number one is, have you seen any indication that the economics profession is taking note of their errors in this circumstance and thinking that a free market can provide something as important as health care to a population, number one? And number two, would it, if such a thing happens, would it last, I guess?
Well, I think the economics profession was really bowled over, and you're quite right about that, by the 2008 collapse. And that's in part because it was in the realm of economics, in the sense that economists had assured, at least most did, that assured us that the subprime mortgages represented no problem, that the financing behind them represented no problem, that the bundling of mortgages into asset-backed securities and then the swaps that were built on top of that, that whole house of cards was very much a financial house of cards, and therefore the failure of the economics profession to understand how fragile it was, or to prepare in any way so that central banks and others could handle it. Yes, that was an embarrassment to the economics profession, but perhaps because we got out of that crash relatively soon, and I'm talking now several years, the economists could console themselves about their failure by saying, oh, well, we got through it. Now the economics profession, instead of having learned the lessons of its own incompetence, its incapacity to understand a system well enough to foresee, let alone plan for the collapse of 2008 or 9, now they have an easier out. They can, and I already see the signs of blaming all of this on a microbe, a virus. You can see President Trump busy at work putting an adjective, a national adjective, in front of the virus. He insists on calling it a Chinese virus.
Right.
He apparently thinks that viruses, like people, live in nations, which any scientist who knows anything would fall over laughing at best. And let me remind you again of what I said. The worst pandemic of this sort, the virus that hit the world in 1918, began in Kansas. So why is it called the Spanish flu? And the answer is Spain suffered extraordinarily from this, and that's why it was called the Spanish flu. It began in Kansas. But no one in those days would have thought to do the ugly, small-minded thing of trying to blame the crisis of today either on the virus or on the country where it hit first. It's disgusting. There's no nice way to characterize it. It is horrendous. I noticed, just a footnote, I noticed that the Italian government, which has been struggling, it's been one of the worst countries hit by the coronavirus. When several weeks ago, the European Economic Union did not give Italy as much help as the Italians thought they deserved from their fellow Europeans, the Italian government turned to the Chinese, who sent over massive quantities of help, medicine, trained doctors, and it has been a very supportive international effort. And the Italians turned to the Chinese because at this point, it's been the Chinese and the South Koreans who have been the most successful. Think of the comparison. We live with a government that to this day continues to insult the Chinese, does not ask for help that it desperately needs. I mean, the contrast of a failed system here with what it could avail itself up of if it weren't primarily committed to the private enterprise medical complex and to the reputations of a government that should have resigned because of its failures long ago.
Professor Richard Wolff, I just want to add a couple comments to that before we go on. And again, we're talking with economist Richard Wolff on the Zero Hour, and that is this. It was also, I did some research on this recently, and it was also called the Spanish flu because Spain was not in the middle of the war effort at that time, and therefore had a more free press than either the US or any of the war participants. So there were more reports in what you might call the media back then, newspapers, about the disease in Spain because they were reporting on it. They were openly reporting, number one. And number two, I went back and looked at some of the cartoons of the time, and they are pretty racist against Spanish people. So this business, Trump is, to me, following in a long line of American hatred and blaming the other in this vile, I agree with you, utterly vile characterization of it as the Chinese virus. But okay, I guess where I would love to go from here, if you don't mind, Richard Wolff, is economics is, I think most people have a mental image of economics as this sort of quantitative analysis of inputs and outputs, and it's math, and it's this and it's that, and you get the number you get. It's kind of a technocratic exercise. But you and I have talked about this before, and I think this pandemic highlights it. I mean, I see it as I think that's an element of it, but I see it as a cultural artifact, a political artifact, a product of the incentive system. I always say economists are people who think everyone's an economic actor except other economists. And, I think it seems to me, but I want your thoughts on it, that what we're seeing now is an illustration of the failure of economics to think more broadly about something like the health sector, because the health sector is behavior, the health sector is biology, the health sector is social, and the ideology of economics says no, it's just the flow of inputs and money through a system, and it will regulate itself if you allow the private sector to dominate, which I think is delusional. But I'd love your thoughts on that.
Yes, I'd be glad to. Even in economics, the narrowness and inadequacy of the profession is sometimes recognized. I'm going to give you an example to show that, but also then to apply it to the coronavirus. In economics, at least in the school, you are taught to distinguish between what are called private costs and social costs. What does that mean? It means that for something to be efficient, anything, raising an interest rate, pumping more money into the economy, building an extra wing on your factory, investing in this or that, all of these kinds of decisions are supposed to be made efficient by a balancing, a calculation of the costs and the benefits. So let's take every private capitalist business there is. It calculates costs or benefits. Should we hire more people? Should we fire people? Should we expand our business? Should we buy more trucks? Whatever. You do a calculation. Students are taught this. You add up the costs of doing the act that you're thinking about, and you add up the benefits that will flow from it. And if the benefits are larger than the costs, you deem the act efficient because it's profitable. That's the logic. It's profitable because the revenues from the act exceed the costs. Then economics did learn, even though it kind of forgets it often, that what the costs are to a businessman are the private costs, the costs that that businessman or woman has to pay. But there are costs of a decision that the capitalist is not required to pay. They are real costs, but they don't figure in the capitalist calculation because he doesn't have to pay them. Let me give you some examples. If you expand your factory and build another wing that has a smokestack, the smoke pouring out of that stack will cause children in the neighborhood to get emphysema or some other disease more often than they would if you hadn't done so. We all know that. Science has done it 100 times. So that's a real cost. Those kids will get sick. Maybe some of them will die. They will visit doctors that cost money. They will have inhalers that cost money. Those are all the real costs of the act of the capitalist to build another wing on the factory. but it's none of those costs that the capitalist has to pay for, so he doesn't count them. Well, then it could be that what is privately efficient and profitable is at the same time socially inefficient and unprofitable, because if you counted the real costs that the capitalist doesn't pay, they outpace the revenues. Okay, therefore capitalism, and this is the punchline, isn't an efficient system, never was, and isn't able to use the metric, if the benefits exceed the costs I have, it's worth doing. That's false. You have to have some mechanism of trying at least, not that you can ever fully do it, but trying to estimate the social costs and figure them in. With Corona, here's the simple example. We know for at least 150 years of medical science that viruses are always with us, that viruses are always mutating, that is changing, and that we will periodically be confronted with viruses that are extremely dangerous to our health. We know that because it has been true for a long time. Therefore, we face the social cost of preparing for that, producing and stockpiling all the mechanisms, the test kits, the hospital beds, the special locations, all of that. But that's not a private cost. Nobody is required privately to do it. So guess what? It isn't done by the private sector. They don't want to bear those costs, and they don't have to. And the government isn't willing to step in because you'd have to tax the people, probably the businesses too, even in this country, to pay for it. And politicians in this private-dominated system want to appear to be friendly to the private sector, impose the minimum regulation, tax them the least, and no one does that better than the GOP and Mr. Trump. And so here we are, discovering that the social cost of not doing what we could have and should have done if we weren't hamstrung by our bowing down to the altar of private profit, that the social cost way exceeds the benefit of having not prepared. That's why I said at the beginning, the money we're wasting and losing now is far in excess of what it would have cost if we had done the calculation in the way that a few economists occasionally admit when they admit that the social costs are not the private costs. We should never have accepted the self-serving logic of the economists. Most of what they do, and I'm one of them, most of what we do is to rationalize and put a pretty mathematical face on something that is cheap and purely self-serving justification for private capitalists not to be interfered with what's profitable for them, no matter what the social cost.
That gets me, and again, we're talking with economist Richard Wolff on the 0 Hour. That gets me to something that's been on my mind. Might seem like a little bit of a pivot, but I think it's directly related. And I've thought about writing about this. I've kind of tried to frame my thoughts around it. We've had now for a year at least a debate about Medicare for all. And of course, my colleagues in the media have utterly failed to report on the true nature of that debate. And needless to say, we're not having a meaningful political debate about it. But it seems to me there's one, I think it's very directly related to what you just said, and that's why I bring it up. You've had this sort of disconnect between Medicare for all advocates, which I would consider myself one, and opponents and so-called neutral journalists who are together in the other trench on the other side. And because you have people saying, economic studies appearing to show that we would save a considerable amount of money over a 10-year period if we were to switch to a single-payer system. And the response is always, oh no, it would cost $32 trillion over 10 years. That's a massive increase in government spending as a percentage of GDP, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have my side basically saying, well, but we would spend 40 trillion if we, or whatever, the latest study says, if we didn't do it. And I always raise my little hand and say, yeah, and we'd have 300,000 more dead people, which is not inconsequential, I think, in the human course of events. All that said, it seems to me that the debate that's being waged, or the war that's being waged secretly, is, and implicitly, is how big should the public economy be versus the private economy. It is true that a $32 trillion Medicare for all expenditure over 10 years would be a significant increase in the public economy, it seems to me. It's also true we would save a lot of money. So first of all, do you agree with my assessment? And secondly, what are your thoughts on a way to frame that conversation so that people start thinking rationally about it instead of saying, as Joe Biden or whomever says, where are we going to find the 32 trillion? Well, we'll find it out of the 40 trillion we would have given to corporations if we didn't do this.
No, I think your logic is clear. Your logic is persuasive. I really have nothing to add to that particular point. I would like to pick up on one implication, though, that I know is going to become hotly debated as part of the same struggle you've just referenced. And that is, people are going to say, well, let's see, Italy, which has arguably one of the very best national health insurance programs in the world. They rank number 2 in the quality of overall health care. By the way, the United States ranks number 34, not number 2. But the point will be made, well, look, the Italians are suffering. They have effectively Medicare for all. My answer would be, what Medicare for all would do, what an enhancement of the public sector by bringing the medical industrial complex under the control of a national health insurance and practice operation, would be 2 or 3 things. Number 1, both South Korea, which is a very non-socialist country, and China, which insists that it is a socialist country, and put aside the pros and cons of the argument. But these 2 very different societies do have in common a national health insurance, government-controlled and regulated system. And at this point, they are the 2 most successful examples of coping with the coronavirus. It ought to tell you, not that they didn't have the problem, which they did, and not that they haven't got flaws in their respective systems, which they do, but it is pretty clear, and they both say so, that their medical industrial system, which is dominated by the government and by social considerations, not by private profits, anything like the United States, has been crucial in their superior performance. Now, the Italian example. Here's the problem. If you have a national health, it helps you, but it is not by itself the magic bullet. It has to be accompanied by a general kind of recognition that a whole host of problems, like medical care and public health, are better handled in a social way than through the medium of private profit enterprises. And there the Italians are woefully behind because, like all of the rest of Europe, neoliberal kinds of cutting back on the role of the government, giving more and more latitude to private enterprise is the problem. And the third thing that I would kind of stress is that not only do we need a national health of the sort we don't have, and not only do we need an appreciation of when and where the government's mobilization of resources is the best way to deal with a problem, and indeed with a threat, I am respectful of people who are nervous about giving the central government that much power. Because after all, my argument is giving the private capitalist sector that much power has proven to be a disaster. So whether the private sector of capitalists has the power or a relatively small number of national leaders have too much power is the problem. My answer is yes, let's relocate the political power, both that which governs the private enterprise and that which governs the government, in a properly democratic system. And by that I mean not only that we all have one person, one vote for our political leaders, but that we likewise have one person, one vote for our economic units, our factories, our offices, our stores. If you put the people in sizable groups who know and understand what they as a group need, it will be the best control we have, both on the private sector and on the public sector, so that we can arrange which sector prevails, knowing that in either case, it's the mass of people that will have the last word. If you want the system to serve the people, you have to put the people in the positions of ultimate power.
Well, that makes a lot of sense to me, Richard Wolff. And do you have time for one more question before I let you go?
Yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
I saw the headline this morning. I didn't get to read the article. It was compelling to me. The headline was something to the effect of Trump and the Republicans are now to the left of the Democrats in their response to the pandemic. And I just throw that out there. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you know, it's pathetic. It has it, like all these things, it has its grain of truth, although that grain is buried in a pile of, how shall I put this politely, excrement from horses. Anyway, here is the grain of truth. The Congress, including the Democratic-controlled House, a few days ago spoke about billions of dollars it wants to spend. This is the equivalent of you're seeing an absolutely destitute person on the street as you pass, and you decide you want to help that person. So you fish 2 pennies out of your pocket and you place them in the trembling hand of the destitute person. It's an unspeakably ignorant at best and malevolent at worst. So here we have the specter that is so pathetic a failure that the Republicans can one-up the Democrats by coming in with much larger sums of money. Mr. Trump is clever at doing this sort of thing. He's in a desperate spot. He was going to run for re-election on a great economy. It's gone. He was going to run for re-election on record low unemployment. He's going to have record high unemployment. He is going for broke. He might as well borrow more money than the world has ever seen, throw it at the American people, the business community, whom he has let down with his failure to plan for all of this, and the mass of people whom he has let down with his failure. So yes, he is going to throw more money. Why this is called more leftist? Well, that's the confusion people have when they think that socialism is to be measured by how much money the government throws at something rather than on the structure of relationships among people where they work and where they live, which is what genuine socialism has always prioritized. But in our strange society, with its poor understanding of these issues, only, by the way, because we've had a taboo for 75 years on having intelligent conversations about the varieties of socialism, their strengths and weaknesses, and so on. Yes, so he has pumped more money. But by the way he is doing it, the time it's taking to do it, the inability of Republicans and Democrats to get beyond their narrow self-interest as establishment elites, all of that is costing us more money by the hour. And they're going to have to ratchet up what they do repeatedly as they discover that what they said 3 days ago has now been undone, partly by their own inaction and failed action. I mean, nothing in a world pandemic, nothing is more urgent than international cooperation on the movement of people, on the movement of objects, on the sharing of medical information, technical information, stockpiles of ventilators. The Chinese don't need them anymore, and they are the most efficient producers. That's an obvious opportunity to get help to the other parts of the world that are just entering the disaster time. Europe, North America, South America coming too. And instead of that, what do we got? We got Mr. Trump, who's become a nationalist in his latest incarnation, and who thinks that blaming foreigners for everything is his royal road to re-election, with China at the top of the list, vying for that position with impoverished Central American immigrants. Blaming foreigners, that's not going to help us. That's not going to facilitate cooperation with China, which is not only the major producer of the goods we need to fight this virus, but is now the most successful at having stemmed the spread of the virus. They have announced in the last few weeks, for the first time in months, that they don't have any new cases of confirmed virus. We know they announced them because they've been doing it for months. I know everyone enjoys saying they doubt the Chinese statistics. Well, that may be reasonable, but then you have to doubt them all. And that means that you will join all of those who look at the stock market and doubt what's being said and are selling like there's no tomorrow.
Well, I think everything that corporations report to the Securities and Exchange Commission is 100% trustworthy, don't you? Unfortunately, I was being sarcastic. Yeah. Unfortunately, we are going to have to leave it there. But Professor Richard Wolff, again, I remind our listeners, Economic Update is your program. democracyatwork.info is website. And as always, a great pleasure and very enlightening to speak with you, even under these circumstances.
Yes, thank you, Richard. And above all, to you and all your staff and your colleagues there, stay safe. We need to get through this. My greatest hope is that the ideology that has governed the United States, putting private profit and private enterprise as the top priority, will come under the scrutiny and the criticism that this virus and its failed attention to it demands. That we will not allow the system to get through this unchanged, since it bears so much of the blame.
Well said.